Hello, welcome to the 6th annual Blue Ridge Bookfest. I'm Rita Van Zandt, and I'm here talking today with two authors who have published a book called Das Haus. Did I pronounce it right? I practiced that a little bit. And it's a very unique book, I think, so we're going to have a good time talking about it today. On my far left, to your right, is Dr. Arthur Heise, and he was former Dean of Journalism and Mass Communication at Florida International University. He was a former reporter before that, an editor in Buffalo, New York. A lot of you retirees are from that area. And he also worked for the Associated Press in Germany, which feeds into this story a little bit. He now lives in Hendersonville.
That's correct.
Finally got wisdom enough to come here, huh?
Yeah, finally got smart.
And then also is Melanie Kuhr. She's a great-granddaughter of a Jewish couple who sold a house to Dr. Heise's father. After a successful big business career, she now is CEO and part owner of an architectural millwork company in Dallas, Texas.
Yes.
So you're still a working woman out every day,
yes,
earning your keep, huh? Arthur, when you retired from FIU, I found an article in 2002 that quoted you, or saying that you were going to write a book, you thought, after you retired. Do you remember saying that?
No, not really.
Okay, I thought that was interesting, a little prophetic 2002.
Yeah.
Maybe you didn't know what you were going to be writing about.
No, if I said that, and I'm sure I did, it's because I had this book in the back of my mind for a good number of years.
You know, I think a lot of people think they have a book that they're interested in, or maybe think other people would be interested in, but I'm really pleased that you two figured out a way to bring it so that all of us could enjoy. You wrote a couple other books before that, right, before this one. Was it when you were still up in New York?
Yes.
And so you had a book writing experience before. Were those self-published? Or?
No, they were published. One was published by Public Affairs Press and the other one by W.W. Norton.
A little bit different then than now in publishing books.
The whole world has changed immensely.
A lot, in a lot of ways. But Melanie, you didn't have any experience with writing books, right?
No, and as I describe myself as an unintended author, so I'm not even sure that I had that little voice in the back of my head saying that I had a book to write. I knew that I had an interesting story from sharing my family's past and sharing the experience that I had in selling this house and actually another property in Berlin, and learning about my family's survivor background and growing up in a household with two Holocaust survivors. So certainly I knew that there was a story, but beyond sharing it with friends and family, had never thought of that it was a book.
So we'll figure out how you two got together, because that's part of the story of the book.
Yes.
If we can start, in 1936, Melanie, your great-grandparents built a home in a suburb of Berlin, is that right?
Karlshorst.
And they were, was it Theodore?
Theodore and Helene Siemenssohn.
And they built a two-story home because they were going to live on the ground floor and rent out the top floor.
Correct.
Which makes a lot of sense, doesn't
right.
it? To me? And your grandmother, Ruth, and your mother, Suzanne, also lived in the home.
Correct. So they were already elderly. Theodore and Helene were already older, but my grandmother, Ruth, was a widow. And my grandfather, Max Levy, fought in World War I for the Germans. He was a decorated war hero. And when he came back from the war, he was a sick man and never really recovered from that. And so she was widowed and had one daughter who was my mother, Suzanne. So Ruth and Suzanne were living with Helene and Theodore, which would not be, uncommon. And Theodore wanted to build this home for the family, and in hopes that after they passed, they would have this 2-unit home that Ruth and Suzanne could live in, and then have it as a rental property and income on the 2nd floor, to sustain them for the future.
A lot of times we think about duplexes that way here in the States.
Yes.
So. After Kristallnacht, then Ruth and Suzanne, well, especially Ruth, decided that perhaps they needed to get out of Germany.
Right. So I think it was very clear at that point that the future was not very secure for the German Jews at that time. So right after Kristallnacht, she started to write ads in the papers in England seeking employment. Now, she was not able to take my mother with because the Germans wouldn't allow that. So luckily, she was hired then by a family in England as a cook and nanny in their 500-year dairy farm in the English Cotswolds. So my grandmother secured employment outside of Germany and left her daughter, my mother, Suzanne, with Helene and Theodore, in hopes then that she would be able to get the family in England to sponsor out her daughter, because the Germans wouldn't allow her to take her child. So about a year afterwards, then my mother fortunately got a spot on the Kindertransport, which was an effort by the English people where they saved 10,000 German Jewish children by evacuating them out of Germany into England. And many of those children then arrived in England and never did see their parents again, because in that case the children got out but the parents didn't. And many of them were adopted then by the English. And but my mother was very fortunate, and she got out on really one of the very last of those transports, and she had her mother waiting for her.
Wow.
But she never did see her grandparents again, because not long after that, they were then arrested by the Gestapo and transported to Theresienstadt, where they then perished.
And we'll talk about that in a minute. Before that happened, they decided that they wanted to sell their house and move, was it more into Berlin?
No, after the family left, then my understanding, really the German Jews at that time, they really could never have imagined what was going to transpire. So while Helene and Theodore had wanted them to seek safe shelter in England, certainly they had hoped that after this craziness subsided, that the family would be able to come back and they would resume their life.
Well, I was talking about Theodore and Helene. Then they sold their home,
right,
and moved into another area. Is that correct?
No, they moved not very far away. They moved into the apartment that my parents lived in.
Ah, okay.
So they traded the apartments. They traded homes. Let's put it that way.
All right. Well, let's bring you into the story now. Your parents buy the home. And that's the history that you know of. And then the war happens. Your family is still there after the war.
Right.
And eventually you are able, your whole family is able to get out. You go to Canada, then end up in New York, right?
A couple of things happen in between, and that is that on May the 9th, 1945, 2 Russian armed soldiers showed up and said, you've got 24 hours to get out.
Of the same home.
Of
right.
this house. And so we had 24 hours to get out. And of course, the city of Berlin had been under constant bombardment, either from the air or from artillery and so on. So we had to trudge all the way across the city to my grandmother's house, hoping that we could stay there. When we got there, we found it was full of Russians also. But fortunately, they left after a week. We stayed with some neighbors, and so that's how the transfer came about.
So and the nightmare that you lived through as a child, you were 6?
Yes.
And remembering all of this, that's a story that a lot of German people who now live in the United States could tell.
Sure.
They went through the nightmare in a way, and then seeing the Russians come in, which America thought was a really great idea, but it really disrupted a lot of German people. How long did it take your family to leave, to apply and then leave Germany?
Well, it took several years. My family came to this country in 1953, but one of the things that complicated it was that my father was a member of the Nazi Party. And that meant that unless he was found to be a nominal Nazi, that the chance of getting an immigration visa to come to the United States were virtually zero.
And I had never heard the phrase nominal Nazi before.
Right.
That's a new piece of information that I wasn't familiar with.
Well, that was established by and we ended up, fortunately, in the American sector of the city, which no one knew at the time when we got there. My father found the apartment, which part we were going to be in. We ended up being one block inside of the American sector, and if it weren't for that, I wouldn't be sitting here. I lost my train of thought.
Well, anyway, nominal Nazi.
In the American sector, and that was my point, they set up a really stringent system of what they call denazification. They investigated people who were members of the party and then classified them according to various categories. And I dug up the paperwork in Berlin for that one time when I was over there, and found out, for example, that my father was expelled from the party in 1944 because he didn't do enough, or he didn't do anything, to support the party, and so they threw him out. So then they had these various categories. Either you were a Nazi, that's not how they put it, but really active in the party. You were inactive in the party, and therefore a nominal Nazi, and that's how that classification came about.
Melanie, I don't know whether you were familiar with all these different terminologies when you heard your story, your family's story.
Right.
You probably just heard the word Nazi.
Nazi, correct. And so there were a lot of threats that were made to my grandfather that if he didn't make a certain amount of payments, that they were going to burn the house down, and they were already, under duress and persecution. So the story that certainly I heard from my mother and grandmother was that, and what is known is that sales from Jewish owners to non-Jewish owners at that time were under duress, considered under duress. And you have to remember that at that time also, after the Nuremberg laws, that the Jewish people they weren't considered citizens, and so they couldn't hold a bank account, and they didn't have rights as citizens. So certainly my grandmother and my mother's understanding of what transpired is that they were forced into selling their family home to the Heise family, and that they never received any money, and that the money was paid to a notary. Now, after doing a lot of research, etc., perhaps the money was, given to the notary, and the notary was a Nazi notary, or the money was never transferred into my family's hands.
The best explanation that I got was from a senior researcher at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington. And because I was totally puzzled by this issue, of what happened to the money.
Right.
Because of the assertions that Melanie's mother and grandmother had made. And what he explained to me is that what in all likelihood happened was that my father paid the money, but that it went into what they called a blocked account, where the Jews were allowed only to withdraw enough money to live on. And then what really complicated this situation was that they were sent to Theresienstadt, and Theresienstadt was advertised as a retirement home for Jews. And so then they were, the money was taken to, quote unquote, buy their retirement residence. I mean, it was all a farce.
So it was just, it was done on paperwork.
It was just
only.
a farce completely, and the money went to the German government, or to the Nazi government, I should say.
And your great-grandparents then lost their lives in
Theresienstadt. So they were in their 80s when they were then deported, and they were in their 80s and did not last very long in Theresienstadt. And the amazing thing about the Nazis is that they were excellent record keepers. So many years later, actually, my grandmother secured their death certificates, of which we still have the original copies.
Oh, wow.
And so my grandmother left with no money. I mean, I think they were allowed to take 5 German marks when they left. And then when my mother left on the Kindertransport, I think that the grandparents knew that likely they weren't probably going to see them again. And so they took as much as they could of jewelry and silver that they thought that they would be able to sell to sustain themselves, and they put it in layers underneath Mother's clothes in, you know, the one trunk that she was allowed to take on the Kindertransport.
So she was able to get some things out.
Some things out.
Wow. Because I'd heard people sewing things into their clothes in various ways. Well, now let's shift forward to the Berlin Wall, 1989, right?
1989.
And I assume both of you are watching this on television.
Well, I happened to be in Costa Rica on business, and it had been a long day, meetings all day long, a dinner meeting and so on. I finally got to my room, and there was this thing on television. I turned on the television as I was getting ready to take a shower, but I didn't turn the sound up. And then I saw, and I looked, and I turned the sound up, and it was the night the wall came down. And it was right then and there that I decided they've had the house long enough. It's time for me to get it back.
So you want to get the house back from the Russians? Were you watching
from the East Germans?
From the East Germans,
yes.
Okay.
Right.
But the Russians had first taken it,
right.
Then it became the East Germans.
Right, exactly.
And were you watching it on television? It didn't.
Well, I was
28.
I mean, at the time I was 28. I was living in Washington. I was married, you know, working on a career, but my mother and grandmother were still alive at that time. So my grandmother was, let's see, 89, so she was about 92 at the time, and she was right on it. And she said, started to write letters, and she was, I'm going to get my house back. I'm going to get the house back that belonged to our family. And not long after that, unfortunately, my mother was diagnosed with a terminal type of cancer, and she was in her early 60s. So those first 4, and then they both passed within 12 weeks of one another in 1994. So I knew that my grandmother was, you know, in this letter writing campaign, and she was going to get the house back. But again, I came from a family of survivors, and if you know about that generation, they don't speak too much about that. And they were very reserved and private about it. So, and candidly, I was 28, and so I wasn't as engaged in it. It was kind of something that was outside of my life at that point. But you know, they were engaged in trying to write letters and find what the restitution process was and how they were going to claim that property.
Then there came a time when there was a cutoff date. If you were going to claim property back in that area, you had to get all your paperwork in. Right. And both of you independently were working on this.
Well, not Melanie, but her mother.
Her mother.
My grandmother.
Right, right. And but you didn't know both of you were working on this.
Well, I found out because when one time when I was in Berlin, there was a register that had all the names of the people who had laid claim to certain properties. And for example, the 2 parties who lived in the house had made a claim for the house. You know, I guess they took a shot in the dark and figured maybe they will never show up and we can get this cheap. And then there was Melanie's grandmother who had made the claim, and that's how I found out, you know, that she was one of the claimants. And anyway, that's another story.
Yeah, and that's what the whole book is about, really. I don't know whether you decided it intentionally when you first started writing the book, but we get your story, Art. Melanie, we get your story, and then it starts blending together when you realize.
Well, really, when when Art contacted me in 1997.
Yeah.
So
97.
in
so
97, right? So that we're speaking, 8 years after the wall came down,
Right.
and something like 7 years after my grandmother had started to write. But like I said, my mother and grandmother had passed away, and with that, kind of the effort. And I hadn't really picked, I hadn't picked up their cause, and it was really when Art contacted me then that it became kind of front and center in my life about, wow, I had unfinished business.
And then during those 7 years that Melanie mentioned, I was busy collecting, trying to find documents about the house, because we had nothing. I didn't have a shred of paper about the house, not one document at all.
But you remembered the address, or how did?
I remembered the address and so on. And then eventually found the German records, which are different than here because they include the entire sales contract and so on. That's why I knew, for example, what I mentioned early on, that they traded homes, which was part of the contract. And I dug all that up, and then we ran up against the wall because I did not realize until I saw that contract that the house had been sold to a Jew. I had no idea about that. And that vastly complicated things because, as Melanie pointed out before, the law that the current German law, says that if anything was sold between 33 and 45, it was sold under duress. And to prove, the burden of proof was on me that it wasn't sold under duress, which I could do to a degree. For example, the easiest part was the price that was paid for the house, at least according to the contract. We had found experts who said that that was a reasonable, fair market value for that day and age.
It could have been $1 or something.
Right. But it was a fair market value according to these experts and so on. But then there were other requirements, for example, that my father would have had to try to get the money out of the country. Well, that was totally illegal under the Nazis. If you try to get money out of the country, you had to have their permission. Well, they weren't going to give you permission to take the money and it was going to go to a Jew and send it outside of the country. That was totally contrary to everything that they stood for.
And in a lot of the reviews of this book, the reviewers have focused on a couple things. Art, they focus on your trying to find out about your father being a Nazi. And Melanie, they focus on you being reintroduced to your Jewish faith. Being born a Jew doesn't necessarily mean that your faith is going to be Jewish. So that comes out in the book. I don't know whether you intentionally did that when you were writing to expose yourself that way.
Well, I think that's really the story of the book. It's more, it's not so much about these transactional things that we're talking about, all the paperwork and the documentation. It was really that you have two people who come together with really different beliefs about how this house, this box of mortar, what it meant to us, how we believe that it came into our lives, and both were kind of raised with these certain thoughts about knowing that this physical house was ours and for what reason. And then I think that, and I don't want to speak for Art, but it was then not so much for me a transaction, but about doing the right and honorable thing for my family. And when you talk about the reviews, the interesting thing is that when you write a book and you put that story out there, you do expose yourself to people's thoughts. And I've had many people feel like I did the wrong thing.
Yes, I wondered about what kind of response you got.
I sold out, and that I didn't do the honorable thing, that I was focused on being able to get the money, and that they would have taken every ounce of money to fight the Nazi, to not allow them to have the house. And I think that part of my story is coming to grips with what would my mother and grandmother have done? What is the right thing to do? And I don't know because they were gone. And Art didn't really know because his parents, the people who really knew the truth, whatever that truth, and likely even their truths would be different because we all have our own personal truth, would be different. So I then, and perhaps Art, had to come to grips with what was our truth. And I think that my feeling was that Art was a child, like my mother was. They were both victims of a horrible circumstance. Whatever may have transpired, Art was that child, my mother was that child, and how can we move forward? And for me, it then didn't become about the money, but it came about putting the past behind and about forgiveness and about moving forward. And in that process, yes, I learned a lot more about my Judaism and my personal faith. It was a lot about forgiveness and moving forward. And I guess that I kind of think about, we can't always live in the past and the sins of our own fathers. So at a point in time, I put that behind me and thought, how can we resolve this? And how can I take this and move it forward in something positive for myself and for my family?
And Art, I assume you also had to come to grips with, because you, in your mind, had that house was going to be yours by itself, by yourself. And you had to also figure out a way to move forward with this story.
Yes, and that was probably one of the more challenging parts of this entire book, is how to work this out. I mean, when I found out, I mentioned the register before, where people had registered for the ownership of the house. And believe it or not, I discovered, we lived in Miami at that time, and I discovered that Melanie's mother and grandmother lived 30 miles away from us.
In Fort Lauderdale.
Wow.
They could have lived anywhere in the world, and here they were.
Yes.
But when we called, they were both dead. It was several years, 3 years, I guess, after they had passed. And so it was a challenge in that sense, that, then I had to track down and find Melanie, and I found her in Texas. And one of the things we agreed to early on was to meet at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, and because I was out in Texas on business, and it was probably one of the most, if not the most excruciating meeting, but certainly one of them for me, because when Melanie pulled out the death certificates of her great-grandparents from Theresienstadt, I mean, that was just like somebody poking me into the marrow of my bone with a sharp knife. I mean, I did not know that until that very moment. And so
I don't want to do a spoiler alert. I want them, the people, to find out what all happens at the end of the book. And this is a wonderful book on so many different levels. I would hope that book clubs would even take it and read it. The things we've been talking about today, I think, would be a good discussion point for people who've read the book then. So Das Haus
in East Berlin.
In East Berlin is the name of it, and it's self-published. So in a way, it's your oral history you are giving to your family, and you've also given to us, and so I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
I don't know how you came about writing, whether there was a specific room you wrote in, or computers help a lot more than they used to, so I don't know whether you sent your manuscripts back and forth to share.
We started out with a rough outline. And then I went out to Texas, and we spent 3 days poring over that outline, changing it around, looking at all sorts of documents that Melanie had, that I had brought with me, and so on. And we kind of hammered out a rough shape of what we wanted to do in the book, and then from there we went and, I wrote my chapters, Melanie wrote her chapters, and we bounced it back and forth and bounced it off other people and so on. She has a cousin who's a professional writer who, helped,
That's a coach.
And so you've set a template up for other people that maybe have a story that they want to tell with 2 different points of view. Thank you very much, both of you, for being here today.
Thank you, Rita.
Dr. Arthur Heise and Melanie Kuhr, and the book is Das Haus.
We thank you.
Thank you.